Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Graham. How's it going, Graham?
It's a wonderful day.
Amazing. And we're here to talk about musicians and artists and other creatives who approach their work from that magical perspective. And we're here again for part 2 of our deep dive into Ngūgī wa Thiong'o and their book, Wizard of the Crow. So if you haven't seen part 1, please go back and give it a watch. This is an incredible, amazing book, and it is such an amazing, sprawling epic. Graham, do you want to remind us and kind of give us an overview about what we talked about last episode, and also remind us about Thiong'o and who he is, and tell us a bit of his story?
Right. So Ngūgī wa Thiong'o was born in 1938 in Kenya. And from the get-go, because of in his adolescence and childhood, he was raised in the Mau Mau War of Independence, which was a very pivotal point in Kenya's history. And because of this, he's always been very engaged in politics and being critical of government, which resulted in 1967 in him being arrested for a year without trial. During this period, he wrote an entire novel on toilet paper while in prison. And it was during this time that he decided to write in his own language of Kikuyu and then translate his own works into other languages. And shortly after this, he's released, in large part thanks to help from Amnesty International. There's multiple assassination attempts on his life over the next 20 years. And what's important about Ngūgī wa Thiong'o is that his works are central and quintessential to a lot of post-colonial theory. A lot of his essays on culture and politics are very important in this field. And his works was really important with his fiction, is that from around the point of his arrest, he decides to shift the focus of his works to having a multi-narrative and multi-viewpoint perspective where they all unfold at different times and spaces, and this replaces the linear temporal unfolding of the plot from a single viewpoint. So to sum that up, the collective replaces the individual as the center of history.
Interesting. Wow.
And so that's important when we look at The Wizard of the Crow, which is considered his magnum opus or his crowning achievement, because there are so many characters in this book. It is absolutely wild, and all their stories interweave and clash and are repelled. It's a very dynamic work that has many viewpoints, and because of that, we're sort of focusing on little snippets of the book as we go along.
Right. It's really something that everyone should engage with, and we highly recommend everyone here who likes these discussions to go read the work itself, because like Graham was saying, we're just going to be focusing on specific characters and events because it's such a sprawling narrative that there are many side narratives that we can't tell you that are worth exploring,
Exactly. You know, it's like 770 pages. It's a dense work, but it is so rewarding.
Hmm.
And the important theme, I guess, of why we're talking about it on this channel is because the, as I like to call it, the slogan of the book, you could say, is that the myth becomes reality. And as the narrative is unfolding and these events take place, other people talk about the events and add their own color, their own perspectives until you have this ever changing, evolving mythology surrounding the characters.
Right. It's such a wild thing. I remember when we were first going through the story, and you start to see how the myths that people tell, the start to conflate and start to evolve and become reality, and then it be hard. You start to be unable to differentiate between what is the myth and what is reality, and people's entire lives get caught up into it. Like before we began here, we were kind of just discussing a bit of the character of the ruler, one of the main central characters. And we're talking about how on one hand, even though he has the most power of any of the characters in the novel, in other ways he has the least agency because he is such a central character in the mythic narrative. He becomes so caught up, the narrative defines him.
Exactly, exactly. And what's important about this is that it's being told, all the entire story is being told by a character in the story. The officer Arigagai Gathir. He's very important to the story. He comes up in many points throughout the novel, and it is him that is telling the story to a crowd of onlookers, and they add their own interpretations and rumors, and those feed into the myth that he is telling. And so it's an engagement. You know, the audience is engaging with his performance, and they're all telling the story together.
Oh wow, I love that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and so today I think we're going to focus mostly on the ruler because he is such a central figure. And we talked a lot last time about how, he has control over time, he has control over all these aspects of Abereria, the country that he rules. And the way that he controls time is that, for example, they're all discussing when is the ruler's birthday. For as long as we've known, it's always been the ruler. There's never been a ruler before this ruler, and there always will be this ruler. And they debate for 7 months, 7 hours, 7 days, and 7 seconds, 7 minutes and 7 seconds. Seven being the ruler's magic number, and they decide to confer with the ruler when his birthday is, and he says, very well, then. My birthday will be the 7th day of the 7th month at the 7th minute, 7th hour, 7th minute, and 7th second. And he can dictate when his birthday is. So it could be July. No, it's January now. And everyone the entire society shifts and tries to accommodate these absurd, narcissistic elements of the ruler.
Right, right. It's always the seventh month, even when he changes it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's like so ridiculous and insane. But also, before we dive into part two, can you kind of just talk a little bit about I know it's a loose plot, but describe a bit about the plot that we went over and where we kind of left off with the first part.
Right. So we talked a lot about the ruler. The story starts with different theories as to why the ruler became ill, and we'll talk about the illness in this episode. I'm not going to spoil that yet. And that's sort of where the narrative unfolds from there. And the wizard of the crow, his name is Kamiti, and we left off with him becoming the Wizard of the Crow, which is him and another beggar are being pursued by the police across the prairie into Santa Lucia, which is the area where many of the poor people live in Abereria. And To scare away the police, he creates a bundle of bones and animal remains and plants and writes a sign that says something along the lines of, "These are the premises of the Wizard of the Crow, he who can bring down birds from the sky." And this scares the police officer. The police officer runs away. But later in his story, the police officer, Arigagai, or AG as they call him, becomes compelled to revisit the wizard. And he returns and asks for advice and spiritual counsel, which the wizard, of course, offers him. And from the police officer AG being such a storyteller, he tells everyone that he encounters about this magical wizard of the crow. And soon everyone in the country knows who he is. Everyone's coming to him for advice and for divining. And he's saying, "How did I end up in this mess?" When really he's just applying knowledge that he learned in his travels in India, his herbology studies as a child, and just, he's basically just extracting. He's very perceptive and insightful at extracting what a person's desire is or what they're suffering from and how to shift their perspective. So the magic that he casts is shifting their perspective on their ailment or on their position.
Absolutely, absolutely. We saw that when he was helping that one police officer, right? When he gives him his advice there, and his advice is basically for him to be a good person and to change, and then you're gonna stop having this kind of these problems,
Exactly. The foes that he seeks are within himself, and he must make peace with himself and make peace with the world around him, and then he will prosper.
But it's interesting, again, in the same way that the ruler is created and is a product of all of this mythology, the wizard is equally so, right? And it's become out of his hands, right? All he did was have to help people, and then they ran with the myth, and now the myth has taken on a life of its own, and he's this grandiose figure, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's wild. So that's where we left off. We should now jump into part 2 here.
Sure. So I decided for this episode to mostly focus on the ruler's illness and how it causes him and the wizard to cross paths, and what happens after the ruler is cured. So here it says, a record of the ruler's illness exists in a paper by the distinguished Harvard professor Din Furyk. The professor had hoped to read it at the annual conference of the Euro-American Medical Association and duly sent them an abstract, but the description of the illness sounded so unbelievable that he was not allowed to present it. The professor did not give up. He sent the paper to a famous journal in England, Nature and Nurture, and on reading it, the editors who earlier had shown interest in it changed their minds. They said that since the illness in question involved the head of state of a friendly country, the publication of the paper would almost certainly strain the relations between Britain and Aberia, to the detriment of cooperation between the two countries in the matters of science and technology. Another journal returned the paper to the author, recommending instead a disreputable publisher of science fiction. So this is just to demonstrate how absurd this illness is, that no one believes him. A copy of the professor's diary in which he describes how he came to write the paper fell my way, and I will draw on it freely to supplement my other sources. So this is the police officer Arigagai Gathir again narrating the story. It seems that the ruler's body had started puffing up like a balloon, his whole body becoming more and more inflated without losing the proportion of parts. Dr. Wilfred, so he's expanding. Yeah. Dr. Wilfred Kaboka, the first to examine him, immediately called for Makukali, the minister, as a witness to his dealings with the sick man. Makukali in turn called all the other ministers, including security, who stood around flabbergasted at the uncanny sight. Not only did the ruler seem on the verge of bursting, but he had also lost the power to speak. The ministers retreat to a meeting to plan how to deal with the ruler's illness and the multitude of problems it generated, such as where would they put him?
He keeps expanding. Where's he gonna go? Oh my gosh.
He would sit and sleep on the floor, it was decided. What would he wear? As his hypertrophy proceeded, his clothes were ripping at their seams. The ruler appeared to be dressed in rags, so they covered him in bed sheets. But what to do about his unrelenting inflation? How to stop it and how to slow it down? Dr. Wilfred Kaboka had tried everything within his knowledge and experience to contain the process, but had now reached the end of his tether. Should they take him to a hospital? They debated time and again, but how to prevent the news from spreading. They authorized the doctor to seek the help of a specialist willing to apply himself only in the ruler's suite. Dr. Wilfred Kaboka contacted Dr. Clarkwell, a New York specialist in obesity and the like, but when he saw the body visibly expanding before his eyes, he dialed Professor Din Furyk for help.
Wow.
So specialist after specialist is like, I don't know what to do about this. Let me call the guy that I think is a specialist.
Right. Because you just can't believe what you're witnessing. An expanding man.
Exactly. I came to know about the illness, writes Din Furyk of the Harvard Medical School, because Dr. Clarkwell was a former student, and whenever he came across difficult cases, he would often call me for advice. His description of this particular case so aroused my curiosity that I dropped everything and went to New York. Gonna jump ahead here. I entered the ruler's room. I would ask other questions only after I had seen the patient. The patient was seated on the floor, his back to the wall. I felt his forehead, took his temperature, listened to his heartbeat. All was normal, though he seemed to be panting a bit from fatigue. But his eyes, those eyes, I've never encountered a look like that in an adult. They looked scared and helpless, like the eyes of a child stricken with fear and the unexpected and the unknown. The
Where are
ruler,
we?
as it's, we're still on slide 5. We're on the right
Okay.
page.
Okay. Sorry.
No worries. I'm about halfway down now. The
I see.
ruler, as his followers invariably called him, seemed to have lost the power of speech. Fortunately, he could still read what was put in front of him, and he would then nod for yes or shake his head for no. Din Furyk tells of how he asked for blood samples to be taken to find out whether the patient exhibited symptoms of hypothyroidism, nephrotic syndrome, polycystic kidney disease, or some form of Cushing syndrome brought on by cortisol hormones in the blood, or any disorders associated with obesity known to science. He was also concerned about the possibility of steroid-induced obesity, despite Dr. Kaboka's assurances that the ruler had never taken any steroids. The Viagra was the only drug for which he had shown an insatiable appetite.
Of course.
Of course. Imagine my shock when they showed that everything about him was functioning normally. How was this possible? Why this continued self-induced expansion of the body? His belly was as taut as a drum, and whenever I tapped it, a sound issued from the mouth. Cur. Or was it coral, or crawl, or cruel? I took Dr. Clarkwell and Dr. Kaboka outside for a conference. What could the ruler be signifying by coral, or crawl, or cruel? Dr. Kaboka's response was strange. He was a physician of the body, not a decipherer of words. So they confront the ministers. We'll go to the next slide here. So I'm not going to read this entire slide. The point is that the head minister, Makakali, strives to talk to the ruler, has no idea what to do, goes back to his room, kneels and prays for divine intervention. There's a knock at his door. I wanted to see you alone, said Arigagai Gathir, or Ilias AG. This is the police officer. So the ruler is in America right now. This is important. They've traveled to America to seek funds for Marching to Heaven, which is the Tower of Babel that they want to construct to the sky. What's the matter, Makakali asked after he gestured for his visitor to take a seat. I don't know where or how to start, but I want to begin by begging you not to take lightly what an underling like me. Do you know the story of the elephant and the thorn? Please spare me the wisdom of folk tales, he said, forcing himself to laugh as if he had been joking, but in his heart he was burning with anxiety. Let me tell you the story all the same. Elephant felt something sharp in his foot, and when he removed it and saw that it was a tiny thorn, he was very angry. How can such a tiny thing prevent a big animal like me from walking? He pushed the thorn back into his foot and walked on, stamping the ground with defiance. The infection that later developed in the foot killed the elephant. Hence the saying, never look down upon the small. True, Hakiya Mungu, which is his catchphrase, which means on God's truth. I too ask you, don't despise the messenger, however lowly, or take lightly the message, however strange. Say what you have come to say. I know of a man who can handle the illness. A doctor more qualified than Professor Furyk. Well, he is not a doctor in the ordinary sense. He is a sorcerer, a diviner. A diviner, a sorcerer in New York, in Abereria, and his name is the Wizard of the Crow. So this is how the wizard gets tangled into all of this.
Oh no.
True, Hakiya Mungu, AG would say when he later narrated what happened during that fateful visit to the USA. Right from the time it first struck, I knew it was no ordinary illness. I also knew that there was only one person who could wrestle it to the ground. But I did not want to volunteer my knowledge. Who would believe my claims that the Wizard of the Crow could succeed where the masters of science in the West had failed? But when I heard that the ruler had started to hallucinate, uttering words that nobody could tell the meaning of, I said to myself, that's it. I will speak out or forever hold my peace. It was clear to me that the whites were at the root of this illness. Do you know how white people hate it when a black man comes up with an original idea? And what can be more original than our ruler's vision of marching to heaven? Whoever they are, on the next slide now, they all stink of racism. I had made up my mind, and the only thing remaining for me was to figure out how I would speak to the ministers in a manner that would bring them to my view of the problem. So we'll jump ahead to the next slide here. So he tells Makakali, I thought Makakali would get up immediately and go to the ruler, but he seemed distracted. Imagine my surprise when the minister asked me to accompany him. True, Hakiya Mungu. This request was entirely unexpected, but I took it as an honor. Imagine the most senior minister in the government asking me to accompany him to the ruler. When we got there, I saluted the ruler and the minister bowed. But instead of talking, or doing the talking or the writing, Makakali pointed at me, clearly not wanting to be a messenger for sorcery. I took out my pen and wrote down my name on a piece of paper, just to remind the ruler that it was me, AG, or as he once called me playfully, the conqueror of jinns. I wrote what I'd already told the minister, that I knew of a sorcerer who could heal him. I saw from the sudden light in his eyes that the ruler was not averse to my suggestion. He looked at the minister and nodded his head as if to say that he was in total agreement with the idea. Makakali's face brightened, and outside the room he put his arm around my shoulder as if we were the closest of mates. This matter of sorcery is entirely between us, he told me. For if the New York media were to know that the ruler was sending for sorcerers from Abereria, they would flock here and camp out at the hotel. Even Professor Din Furyk and Dr. Clement Clarkwell were not to know anything about this new development. As for the other ministers, who would tell them only after the sorcerer had arrived. We'll jump ahead to one more slide. The Wizard of the Crow is a modern sorcerer, I told him. He dresses in suits. Besides, he only uses a mirror for his divinations. True, Hakiya Mungu. Minister Makakali's jaw fell and his eyes almost popped out at my description of the Wizard of the Crow and his divine mirror.
I just love this too, because the divine mirror is such a hugely important shamanistic tool that you see in many different cultures and many different frameworks. You know, gazing into a mirror is also such an important magical metaphor for that experience of finding the self and self-knowledge, and, you know, engagement with the other, with the natural world in order to see the self. We see it in both, like, for example, in the Greek and in the Indian traditions. We have the mirror of Aphrodite, or you have the mirror of Parvati. But in both ways, it's the same idea. It is through this engagement with that other that you can know the self, and it is only through the reality that the beauty of the goddess is known. Anyway, I just love this kind of thing, and it makes me think too of like the black mirrors we see with the Saturn kind of scrying that was a big thing in South America, or that you see in Europe with people like John Dee, and in the grimoire tradition, you know, A lot of this magic mirror stuff is really, really powerful, really cool.
It is, and there are a few instances throughout the book where he uses the mirror, and it's quite profound, very magical.
Cool.
So we'll jump to near the bottom of this slide. Makukali was relieved at the airport when he saw the Wizard of the Crow in a dark suit, a briefcase in hand, looking every inch a businessman like any other in New York. So he's like, oh, thank God he doesn't have these bangles and bones
Yeah.
and stuff. You know, very outdated perception of what a sorcerer could be.
Right.
They did not speak much on the way to the hotel, where Makukali whisked him straight up to the ruler's floors without registering the newly arrived guest. There was to be no record of the sorcerer's visit. Do you need anything? He asked him as soon as he had been shown his room. Take a bath, change, and then let's get to the ruler. Or how about a bite of something first? Instead of answering, the Wizard of the Crow looked now at the minister and then at AG, as if puzzled as to who was whom. And he asks, is either of you in a position to tell me what the ruler wants to see me about?
Oh, wow. He still doesn't
So
even
they
know
haven't
what
even told him.
Yeah.
They haven't even really told him why he's here. They just had him summoned from Abereria. This head of secret police facilitates the transferring of the wizard to America.
Oh, wow.
But they don't tell him anything.
They forgot to inform him what's going on.
Yeah. Excuse me, said AG in Kiswahili quickly, sensing the tension, somehow trying to address them both as equals. We do not do what the English call an introduction, or in Kiswahili, making people know one another. This here is the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. and Dr. Makukali. Didn't Minister Sikioku tell you what this is about? Makukali asked. Only that the ruler had sent for me. Makukali did not go into details with the ruler's illness, but told the wizard that he was to use all the powers he was reputed to possess to heal the chief. He was to return to Abereria the following morning. It was that simple. I'm a little jet-lagged, the Wizard of the Crow told Makukali. Let me get some rest so my head can work clearly. And he's like, jet-lagged? What would a sorcerer know about jet-lag? So so right off the bat, they don't like each other. And let us meet tomorrow then, Makukali says. We'll hop to the next slide. Makukali did not know quite how to break his news, but decided that plunging into the matter was the best policy. He wanted to go about it gingerly so as not to offend the minister's egos. He began not with the sorcerer's arrival, but with a brief account of how it came to be that the sorcerer was in New York, and how the ruler himself had not been in agreement. To Makukali's surprise, a few even admitted that they had heard of the Wizard of the Crow, had been thinking along the same lines, and had kept their views to themselves only because they had wanted to give science a chance. Even Dr. Wilfred Kiboka did not express any doubts. So deep in their minds, they're all thinking the Wizard of the Crow can help him, but they're all too afraid to speak up.
No one wants to. It's that thing, right, where we all kind of have that faith, or we want to believe in magic, but at the same time, we don't want to be caught with our pants down. What if the magic fails, right? You know, but there is that power, there is that desire to believe, right? It's also, you're witnessing with the it's also, I think it's important to understand too that we're witnessing something that's magical happening to the ruler. And I think everyone understands this. So they're like, how do you can't fight a magical disease with science. You know, it's not anything normal that's afflicting the ruler. It's this communal disease that's a manifestation of all of this lying and manipulation of reality, you know?
Exactly. That's well put. We'll go to halfway through the slide here. They agreed after much discussion that they should not show too much eagerness to meet the wizard, that they should simply cast quick glances in his direction in order not to give him the notion that he was in the same ranks with ministers. They also resolved not to tell the wizard about the white doctors, and not to tell Doctors Furyk and Clarkwell about the wizard. Were the ruler's health to improve, what did it matter if Harvard science took the credit? Mr. Minister, my motto is get it by the roots, and the illness shall be no more. If I am to root the illness out, I must talk to whomever I deem necessary. Okay, you may see all the ministers, his security men, and his doctor. How many doctors does he have? Just one, Dr. Wilfred Kaboka, his personal physician. He never leaves his side. Is it the only doctor who has seen him? No other doctor. Yes, fine with me. But the wizard doesn't believe him, and he takes out his mirror, and he says, if you look hard at yourself, you will see what I am seeing. I will ask you again, is Kaboka the ruler's only doctor? And I will answer you again, why would I lie to you? Keep looking at the mirror, said the Wizard of the Crow. What do you see? Do you see something white, like the whiteness of white people? Two white figures. No matter how hard you tried, Makakali could not see any face other than his own. No, this is a charade, he said, and looked away. But the Wizard of the Crow continued to look intensely at his palm, as if it were a handheld mirror. There they are, the wizard said excitedly. Makakali turned his eyes to the mirror and stared feverishly. He saw nothing. There are two wearing stethoscopes. One walks like he comes from New York, very confident in the streets, and the other, where is he from, he said, fixing his eyes on Makakali. So he's already determined that there's other people involved. Makakali's lips trembled. How did he know about Furyk and Clarkwell and that they were from different places? Makakali had forgotten that last night he left the Wizard of the Crow in AG's company. He looked at the wizard, and for a few seconds they sized each other up. Oh, those two. It is strange, but really I never thought of them as doctors. I thought that you would not want to see Professor Den Furyk and Clement Clarkwell. I've heard it said that white science and black sorcery do not mix, that they are like night and day. Are you sure you want to talk to them as well? The Wizard of the Crow indicated with a gesture that the two of them should now sit down for an additional chat. Mr. Minister, Mr. Minister, when I said that I wanted to talk to everyone who has come in contact with the patient, I meant what I said. How do you want me to introduce you? Tell them the truth, that you are a sorcerer, that I am a healer, an African healer, that I trap the bad to save the good. Leave that to me, Makakali said. Whom would you like to talk to first? You. Well, what do you want to know? How it all began. And now we come to the onset of the illness and the cause for it. So basically, they're all waiting for a courier from the global bank to send them a letter saying basically that they've approved the funds for marching to heaven. But the global courier service arrives, and with a letter brought from the global bank. And would someone sign for it, please? We're halfway down the slide here. The ruler nodded toward Makakali. Makakali handed the letter to the ruler, who was about to take the envelope when he realized his hand was trembling in anticipation. To avoid exposing this to everybody, he asked Makakali to open it and read its contents aloud for all the table to hear. What was important, after all, was the message, and not the messenger. So you understand, then, that even the ruler and all of us were expecting good news, Mr. Makakali told the Wizard of the Crow. But on the glancing at the letter, I felt something cold in my belly. The letter was about 10 lines. After reviewing the entire project, the global bank did not see any economic benefits to marching to heaven. To argue that the project would create jobs, as the Aberrarian government had claimed, was a case of outdated Keynesian economics. Neither old-fashioned nor neo-Keynesianism had any place in the modern global economy. The global bank cannot release funds on the basis of the current representation. If Aberraria wanted to pursue the matter further, it would have to make a better case. Money was not the problem, but the global bank cannot pour money into a project in which the sky was literally the limit. Aberraria was given 7 days, note the number 7 again, to come up with the better facts and arguments for the global bank to reconsider funding marching to heaven. Everyone in the room was stunned. They did not know where to look, down, up, away, sideways, or what. All they knew was that they did not want to look at the face of the ruler. It was worse for Makakali, and even now, as he told the Wizard of the Crow the story of that day, the minister could feel the chill in the room after he had read the letter. His lips trembled. He felt paralyzed. Should he hand the letter to the ruler? Should he opine that at least the global bank had not closed the door? The sepulchral silence seemed to intensify by the second. The ruler stretched out his hand as if to see the letter for himself. It was handed to him, and Makakali quickly sat down. The ruler rose to make his speech, completely unaware that the letter in his hand was now shaking. They sat glued to their seats, anticipating his every word. But when the ruler opened his mouth, no word came out. The ruler stood there, trying pointlessly to speak. What? The ruler, lost for words? Terror struck them all. Here was the ruler, his mouth open, attempting to say something, but producing only hot air and bronchial wheezing. The true horror was only a few seconds away. Suddenly, his cheeks and stomach began to expand. No, not just the cheeks and the tummy, but the whole body. They looked at one another in dismay. They had never seen anything like this. The ruler gestured with his hands that he wanted pen and paper, but he could not even hold the pen properly, his fingers fattening by the second. The official biographer tried to give him his thick pen, but the ruler waved him away. The ruler indicated that the gathering was over. Even now, as Makakali narrated the events, his heart was beating wildly as if the whole scene was unfolding afresh before his very eyes. So, let me sum up what you just told me, the Wizard of the Crow said. The global bank denies a loan for marching to heaven. The ruler's body begins to swell, and he loses the power of speech. So this is important because the ruler in his world has never been denied anything.
Right.
Anything he wants is given to him greedily, and he devours it eagerly, you know? And so it's for him to come with this big proposal for this Tower to Babel, you know, this Tower of Babel, this tower to the sky that will create jobs and yada yada, and they want money for
The
it. And then
bank is so brutal to him too, right? They're like, this is nonsense. It's not going to generate anything. It's just a money vehicle. Like, why would we fund this? You know?
Exactly. And so he's shocked. And this, I think it's a fear, that the fear that there are people who have more power than he does causes him to inflate and lose his power of speech.
Yeah, he loses his power when he can't be that all-encompassing ruler, right? When there's that conflict.
Exactly. So Furyk claims he heard him try to say coral or crawl or cruel. You had better ask Din Furyk, though I think he was hallucinating. But in the light of my narrative, you have now decided that it is not necessary to see Din Furyk or Clement Clark. Well, I can ask them myself. Or get Dr. Wilfred Kaboka to meet them and try to get the exact words and even take their answers for you. This is what I need from you, the Wizard the Crow said, ignoring the hints and offers. 2 things. Get me a big wall mirror that 2 or 3 people can look into at the same time without crowding one another. The mirror should be put against the wall facing the bedroom or the seat of the patient. There is a mirror on the wall. Then ask Din Furyk to come in. I quickly changed the subject and told him how I was glad. Oh yeah, so now we're coming from Din Furyk's perspective. I quickly changed the subject and told him how glad I was to meet him to discuss a strange illness that had befallen their leader. A strange malignity, this self-induced expansion, rare, never ever heard of before. Yes, that was it, and I suddenly realized I'd given a name to the oddity. SIE, self-induced expansion. Because of course we have to categorize everything with the science. He listened attentively to my story without interruptions. But when I talked about pressing the patient's belly, only to hear the words coral, crawl, or cruel issuing from his mouth, the so-called Wizard of the Crow raised his head. He asked me, did he say coral, crawl, cruel, or corroir? At first I could not tell the difference in the sounds. He repeated the words, pronouncing each slowly and distinctly, until eventually I heard the differences. I had to admit that his own word sounded nearest to that emitted by the ruler. So I told him, yes, that's the word. Then why should the man be obsessed with the Cold War, now a thing of the past? So he's still misunderstanding him, thinking he says Cold War, not Cold War. He asked again, and this word or sound came out only when you tapped his tummy. Yes. Are you sure? He asked, and I answered yes. He wrote that down in his notebook. What about when the other doctors tapped the ruler's tummy? I told him that I was the only person who had done so. I asked him if there are any other questions. At first he did not answer me. It was as if he had not even heard me. I was about to leave when I heard him call out to me. He came nearer. Up to then he had said or done nothing to suggest he was a witch doctor. His way of doing things and asking questions was not much different from that of any modern doctor. I saw no signs of voodoo or juju paraphernalia. But when he now explained in a low voice what he wanted me to do, I could not tell whether he was playing tricks with me or not. Then I felt like laughing. He wanted me to walk past a mirror on a wall. The Wizard of the Crow had never met the ruler face to face, and his image of him, tall, big-bodied, but not fat, had been formed from watching television and reading newspapers. The ruler cared about his appearance, but was not one of those leaders who wears colorless monkey skins, dashikis, or collarless shirts. He was always in Western-style suits decorated with patches from the skins of the big cats that were exclusively his. There was the famous leopard skin hat shaped like a crown, the symbol of his exalted office and power. That was more or less what was in the wizard's mind when he entered the sick chamber. He had expected a difference, especially in one so now afflicted, but never this that had appeared before his eyes. So even the wizard is like,
What
what?
is going on?
He was struck by a stench, such as he had often detected in the streets of Elders, except that now it seemed to be oozing out of the ruler's body. Now, this stench is important. We talked a lot about this in the first episode. He can smell what seems to be greed or gluttony emitting from people and from things that are created by those people. So money handled by greedy people. And so
Wow.
this stench is overwhelming him coming from the ruler. The
It's
ruler's
also
eyes.
important. It's
Hmm?
also just important to mention, right, that the smell is such an important magical thing, right?
It is.
It's a sense that invokes memory, and it's essential to most mystery magical rites. They always have incense, they always have some kind of smell that is invoked in order to transport you. So yeah, really interesting. But yeah,
Exactly. Those with the ears to hear, those with the snouts to sniff, as I like to say.
right? Gnosis, right?
Yeah. So at the bottom here, the ruler's eyes were full of fear, and the Wizard of the Crow could not tell whether it was fear of the illness itself or of him, an unknown presence. The first thing resolved the wizard was to still any doubts in the patient's mind, because confidence in the healer is paramount in the healing process. Listen very carefully. First things first, if you hear what I am saying, nod your head twice. The ruler nodded twice. Good. If you can hear, you will certainly be able to talk. Don't worry. There is a strange illness in the land. It is a malady of words. Thoughts get stuck inside a person. You have seen stutterers, haven't you? Their stammer is a result of a sudden surge of thoughts or calculations or worry. Now I ask you, who has more worries than a head of state? Who said that uneasy lies the head that wears the crown? What I want you to do is very simple. Look at the mirror on the wall. The people who have had close contact with you, the ministers, the security men, and doctors, will all pass in front of the mirror. Your task is to simply look at their reflections. Let your mind wander freely, forming its own impressions. But don't worry about putting your thoughts into words. What is important now is for the mind and the heart to think and feel. Let your images, feelings, and thoughts float freely. I will trace the paths of your thinking to see where you are obstructed. I want you to help me. I will give voice to your thoughts and feelings. I want to help you break your own silence to yourself. I am only a catalyst, conveying your very own thoughts. The ruler nodded in agreement. So this is important here. I am only a catalyst conveying your very own thoughts. This is how the wizard uses his magic. He finds the source of their anxiety or their distress and gives a voice to that. And that is what heals them.
Very
So
much a mirror, right?
very much a mirror. Makukali was the first to pass by the mirror. The ruler narrowed his eyes, and the skin on his forehead broke into discernible folds as he followed Makukali's move across the room before leaving it. He shook his head from side to side so slightly that had the Wizard of the Crow not been concentrating on the ruler's image in the mirror, he would have missed the motion. In the folds of the skin on the ruler's forehead and the light in his squinty eyes, the Wizard of the Crow detected intense anger. The other ministers took turns before the mirror, but none triggered the look that the ruler had given the Minister for Foreign Affairs. When it came to the security men and his personal physician, the ruler averted his eyes, as if he would prefer them not to see him in these circumstances. Din Furyk and Clement Clarkwell were last. Suddenly the ruler made efforts to stand up, but to no avail, still managing to blurt out, "If." The sound is actually korwo, which means if. That's a little note that they have on the next page. When Din Furyk heard this, he forgot that he was supposed to walk past the mirror and leave without saying a word. He turned to the Wizard of the Crow and shouted, "That's the word." That's the word he was saying. Korwo, or if. As if responding to Furik's fury, the ruler kept on repeating the if word, vainly trying to use the wall as support in his attempt to get on his feet. The Wizard of the Crow signaled for Furik and Clarkwell to leave the room. This is important because we don't talk about, I skipped over this, but another patient that he helps with the divining mirror is afflicted by the if curse, and he cures him. And I'll explain the parallels between it in a moment. The ruler was panting, trying to stand up while uttering the if word that had left him exhausted. He rested his eyes on the wizard as if demanding to know, "What is it?" The Wizard of the Crow answered him, "No, you are not lost for words. It is just that the thought of the indignity heaped on you before your ministers and underlings was so overwhelming that initially no words would come out. Now when you saw those two whites walking nonchalantly before the mirror, as if they were not aware of your presence or what their kind have done to you, you wanted to give them a piece of your mind, but you got stuck. Stutterers are sometimes unable to get past the first word. Just like you get stuck at the word if. If I had been white, would they have done what they did to me? Or if I had been white, would they have treated me the same way they just did in the presence of my ministers?" "That's right," said the ruler, loud and clear. "That's what I was trying to tell them. Go and tell my ministers that I want them all to hear for themselves what I was trying to tell those whites." That was the Wizard of the Crow, who was at a loss for words. He was so taken aback by the ruler's quick recovery of voice that he did not know how to respond to the order.
Wow.
So this is an affliction that happens to another character. They become possessed by money, and they start counting their money, and then they start saying if, and he obsessively looks in the mirror saying if and clawing at his face. And the wizard deduces that he has what he calls white sickness or white ache, which is that he's saying the character says, I'm soon going to be the richest person in Abereria, and then maybe I could be the richest person in the world. But even if I'm the richest person in the world, because of the color of my skin, I will not be respected.
Right. Oof.
And yeah, it's very intense. Yeah.
Well, the glass ceiling is real. The glass ceiling is real, right? And these people realize it all too well as Africans, right?
Yeah, it's something that they've seen in their living experience.
Absolutely. Wild.
So he was about to tell him on the next slide here that his diagnosis had barely begun when the ruler repeated his command. "Be quick. Get them here without delay," he said, as if talking not to a healer, but to a messenger. The Wizard of the Crow left the room and passed the message on to Makakali, who hastened to gather the others. As the Wizard of the Crow returned to his room, he ran into Furik and Clarkwell. They wanted to know what happened, and he met with success. "I managed only to release his tongue, nothing more. At least he is now talking," replied the Wizard of the Crow, looking directly into the eyes of Din Furik. "He's still monstrously obese, though his rate of increase is slightly less than it was." Furik's reaction was entirely unexpected. "You're a fraud," he said, wagging a finger at the Wizard of the Crow. "You're claiming success based on my work. I discovered the illness and even gave it a name. I challenge you in the name of science to a race for the cure for self-induced expansion. But I warn you, the patient is mine, and I will patent to the patient the name of the illness and any cure."
Oh, there's that greed virus on full display, right? I gotta patent it. I gotta name it. It's gotta be mine. Oh,
the
gross.
patient is mine. The patient is
Right?
mine. Like
It's
it's
all
so
mine.
possessive. So possessive.
So wild.
So it is said that when his ministers and the entire entourage entered the ruler's sick chamber, he did not greet them with the usual preliminaries. He simply started talking as if resuming the interrupted luncheon. Even the letter delivered by the messenger of the Global Courier Services was in his hands, exactly the way he held it the day Makakali handed it to him, and he kept on waving it as a prop, evidence, and talisman. "Yes, if my skin was white, would the directors of the Global Bank have insulted me as they have in this letter?" he asked the ministers, who roared back a resounding "No." To say that the ministers were astounded is to understate their various expressions of relief and disbelief. The ruler was panting as if he had not gotten used to the burden of speech, though his body showed not the slightest sign of deflating. But at least it no longer seemed on the verge of bursting, so his words, whatever their sense, were most welcome to their ears. I've thought a great deal about the letter, and I've decided that we have to take up the challenge and come up with arguments that can and will make the governors of the global bank change their minds. They all gave him a thunderous ovation. This time, he told them, he would not write a paper. He would press the case in person through oral arguments. He asked Maka Khalif to draft a quick note inviting we'll leave it there. So he asked him to draft a quick note inviting the governors to come back so that he can speak to them. And rumor has it that the ruler talked non-stop for 7 nights and 7 nights and days, 7 hours, 7 minutes, and 7 seconds. So there's this magic number coming up again. By then, the ministers had clapped so hard they felt numb and drowsy. Some did not realize they themselves had become hoarse and were now producing barely audible whispers of more. Give us more. Couldn't agree with the mighty one more. Some could barely complete a sentence, then a word, then a syllable. When they became too tired,
their sycophancy has taken on a parasitic, lustful consumption. It's become a demon of greed. Oh, so wild.
It's weird. Yeah.
Right?
When they became too tired to stand, they started kneeling down before the ruler until the whole scene looked like an assembly in prayer before the eyes of the Lord. But soon they found that even holding their bodies erect while on their knees was equally tiring, and some assumed the cross-legged posture of a Buddhist. Others opted for the crouching posture of a Muslim at prayer, touching the floor with their foreheads and taking their time to lift their heads. A few, unable to lift their heads, pretended to be in continuous obeisance, with heads and hands on the floor and their buttocks in the air. In the end, each person tried any posture that gave his legs, neck, arms, and even lips some rest. The biographer lay flat on the floor, trying to write down everything the ruler said. Eventually, he rested his head on one side of the book and somehow managed to continue scrawling notes for the Book of Life. The Book of Life, that's the name of the official biography of the ruler. Because the story of the ruler is the story of Abereria and the story of the world.
It's a great day for Abereria and therefore the world.
The world. Yes, yes. By the 7th hour of the 7th day, the security men who used a wall to prop themselves up were some of the very few who remained on their feet. Among civilians, Makakali held out longest, but he too felt his knees about to buckle. Ever careful not to offend, he tried to approach the ruler for permission to sit down, but found himself kneeling, groggily moaning, "Yes, my lord, amen, anything," as if engaged in a call and response ritual with the ruler.
Oh, interesting.
That, it is said, was the scene that confronted 3 messengers from the global bank when they arrived at the chamber at 1 o'clock on the 7th day. They did not show undue surprise, not when they saw the hideousness that was now the ruler seated on the carpet leaning against the wall, the ministers in the various praying postures, and no, not even when they looked at the men and saw the agony of their haggard faces, because the visitors took this to be a native religious ritual. They were bank diplomats who had been trained to understand that money knew no religion, race, skin color, or gender, that money was the root of all money, the only constant law of the new global order. Still, they had been trained to be sensitive to the diversity of cultures, and so their only fear was intrusion, lest they hurt any nerves by intruding into a live religious rites. One of the diplomats looked around to see if there was anyone to whom he could offer apologies.
But this is funny, though. We also have to point it out because, even that it's also important that the narrative that while there probably is, there is obviously racism. The global bank is not the racist force. That is, even though the ruler and the ministers are imagining them this way, all they give a shit about is money. And they're trying to be as culturally sensitive and as respectful as possible. They're letting them put on this whole charade, and they're like, this is not going to influence us in any direction because we do not give a care about your religion. And whatever you're doing is just religious by our standards. All we care about is money. The only thing that can move those ministers would be if you could somehow guarantee them actual money,
Exactly. That's well put.
It's so wild.
We'll go to the next slide here. The most senior of the three bank officials now took it upon himself to get down to business. Excuse me, he said to no avail. Mr. President, sir, Mr. President, we bear an urgent message for you and are pressed for time because of other engagements. The phrase urgent message did the trick and the ruler switched off. He beheld the briefcases in the hands of the three officials. We have been sent to you because you had intimated that there was new information you wanted the bank to take into consideration. But before we come to that, we have in our hands two reports concerning the present state of your country, and the bank has a few questions regarding them. The first concerns your women. We have heard that Aberrarian women have started beating up men. In our view, this is taking women's liberation too literally and too far. Female violence to counter male violence is not the answer to domestic violence and it poses a serious threat to family values, which as we know them today, are the very foundation of a stable social environment. Pretty wild.
Okay, so we have to highlight this because what's hilarious here is even though those global bankers are there's another layer here. They're claiming that they're not racist. They're claiming that their only motivation is pure profit, yet they immediately spew a myth, probably one that's a complete lie about these women, right? Beating up men.
There actually are incidences that happen where women beat up wife abusers.
Well, but they're turning it into something it's not.
Yeah.
Though, right?
Yes, they are. They're spinning it into this grand narrative.
Your family, all of the whole foundation of the Aberrarian family is under attack because these women are getting justice. Like, what the fuck?
Exactly. It's very absurd. It's blown out to absurd proportions.
Right.
The second concerns this business of queuing. You told us, I believe, that you had put a stop to mass queuing. But we hear that there are people on motorcycles going around saying that you want the queues to resume, that in some areas people are taking this call seriously. What, Mr. President, do you have to say on those 2 points? So the queuing, it starts with the Wizard of the Crow, where he's standing waiting for a job. And there's a sign that says, no jobs come tomorrow. And people start lining up behind him. And soon there's lines that go all around the country. And they feed into themselves because the person leaves the front of the line thinking there's no jobs. The line moves forward. They see that the line has moved forward and think that, jobs are being offered. So they go around to the back of the line.
Oh my gosh. So it's a constant looping cycle of everyone.
It's a constant loop. And these are and there's rumors that it's like a result of terrorist action, anti-government protest is an anti-government protest and stuff.
Meanwhile, it's just all desperate people looking for work.
Yeah. And the ruler sent out 5 motorcyclists to each point of Aberraria to promote people to keep standing in queues because he sees it as a devotion to him and a devotion to marching to heaven.
Oh my God.
So what are you talking about? The ruler asked, puzzled, having forgotten all about the motorcycle riders. They were on the next slide here.
Oh my God.
In fact, slightly annoyed that they seemed to be more informed about his country than he was. Oh, sorry, we're back 1 slide. Sorry, my bad.
No, that's all right.
I am sure that the queuing nonsense is the work of a terrorist dissident movement. But what I don't understand is your claim that true men, are allowing themselves to be beaten by women. Do these women want to become husbands, turning men into wives, he said, trying to make light of the matter. That's the point, Mr. President. Everything is upside down in your country. Your women are challenging the natural order of things, even setting up what they call people's courts. And the queues challenge the social order. We don't need to remind you of the obvious. If the masses take the law into their own hands, you will have nothing but chaos on yours. Extreme democracy. Direct democracy.
Oh no, how dare we have direct
I know, right? It's so absurd. The Greeks of old in the city-state of Athens, I believe, tried it. And what happened? It brought down Greek civilization. So,
God.
It just goes to show that the powers that be that control the money don't want women to have a voice, and they don't want democracy to have a voice, because democracy
Or
will
social
challenge.
justice of any
It'll
kind.
it'll challenge the status quo, which is, corporate oligarchs.
Absolutely, absolutely, right? No, everyone kind of knows it. It's about getting disaffected young men riled up and angry is how you maintain these oligarchic type systems, you know, and you oppress the women. But as soon as you allow more of an equality and you allow for people to have any kind of freedom, you stop the fighting, you stop the oppression, you allow social justice, then they're immediately going to seek social justice out on other things, right? Once you have social justice in the home, why not social justice for these corporate CEOs? Why not social justice for these
Exactly.
government ministers, right?
Exactly.
And the powers that be can't have that, right? These racist bankers, these white bankers, they can't have that. But they're
No, they
not racist,
can't.
right? God,
Ridiculous.
so
Mr.
wild.
President, Mr. President, go back to Aberia, put your house in order, then send us a memorandum addressing anything new you wish us to consider. We were on the same, this slide.
This slide?
Yeah, the bank will review it thoroughly, but please excuse us. We have another appointment, the bank official said, glancing at his watch, and followed by the other two, also clutching their shiny briefcases, he went out, muttering under his breath, "Oh damn, we're already late." The ruler was aghast that the bank's officials would walk out without having heard his economic theories and philosophy, and especially his architectural vision for marching to heaven. His jaw fell, his neck became limp, and he inclined his head to one side against the wall. His was a silent scream. "Oh no, not again," Makakali said under his breath. Deja vu all over again. He remembered the Wizard of the Crow. He anxiously looked for him all around the chamber, but did not spot him among those present. He went to the door where AG was standing. "The malady of words has struck a second time," he whispered. "Where is the Wizard of the Crow?" Where indeed? So now we
Right.
go back to the Wizard of the Crow's perspective. He sees the representatives from the global bank, thinks, "Oh, they must have just finished and listened to fresh arguments." But had Makakali not said that they would be here in 7 days? Had he been sleeping all that time? I must have been very tired. He turned around and looked hard at the men walking away. There was something familiar about them, yet he could have sworn that they had never met before. What was it in their looks, their dress, their gait that made him feel so? And now he could not believe what dawned on him. The general's deportment was exactly like that of some of the people he had encountered in his flight as a bird. Was he still dreaming? So he has a couple moments where he leaves his body and enters and becomes a bird, and he flies around the country and looks at the destruction, the poverty, the inequality rampant in his country.
Oh,
And
that's
so he
wild.
must have, and so he sees these people in this bird vision. He had heard and
Oh,
even read stories of people who walked in their sleep, who could even go to the market and buy goods while still asleep, return home and go back to bed. When they awoke, they would wonder how the goods had appeared in their rooms. He had read about the case of a man who had killed his wife and in court claimed that he had sleepwalked through all of it. Was he the Wizard of the Crow, sleepwalking? So he decides to find out. Instead of entering the ruler's room, he follows the diplomats. And we'll go to the next slide here. He saw the three enter a cream-colored limousine. He tried to stop yellow cabs, but the drivers sped away from him, one stopping to pick up a white couple farther down the road. Fortunately, a black cab driver came to his rescue. "Follow that limousine," the Wizard of the Crow told him. And so he follows them to a building. I'm not going to read this entire slide here. What's important is that he follows them to the building, and he's waiting around. He tries to send a message to them through the receptionist, and they're like, "Nothing. You'll have to sit here and wait." So he's waiting. While he's waiting, he sees a pregnant woman exit a cab and enter a hotel. And out of nowhere, he starts thinking of Ngūgī, his lover, as an expectant mother. He had always longed for family founded on love and respect among husband, wife, and children. So go to the middle here. His need to see Ngūgī was by now bottomless. He had been away far too long. He recalled that even Makakali had told him that he was needed only for a day and would be returned home the very first after he had administered his cure. Maybe the ruler had become recovered and become well. Maybe he was still talking. Whatever the case, it was clear that his services were no longer needed. So he, before he leaves at the bottom here, he decides to leave a message for Makukali. He wrote, "I have no pass. Take care of yourself. The country is pregnant. What it will give birth to, nobody knows." This is
Oh,
the cryptic message he leaves.
oh, interesting. What's gonna come after this freaking tyrant? What is born in the wake of all of this insanity?
What will be birthed exactly? The loading
Wow.
of the so now they go back to the ruler and his ministers also go back to also travel from America back to Aberia. And they have to basically push and squeeze. They have like a special jet that they have with like seats moved away for the ruler to be able to fit. They're struggling weeds. They finally get the ruler into the plane. That's all that we need to know from this slide.
Wild.
What's going on here?
Here we go.
Slide 50. Sorry, my computer's being kind of weird. Here we go. Okay. So Makukali is, oh yeah, before they get on the plane, Makukali is given the letter from the wizard, but he doesn't read it. He just puts it in his jacket pocket. And now he decides, as he dwells on the matter, he's on the plane. As he dwells on the matter, he reached for a handkerchief in his pocket and felt the folded piece of paper handed to him at the reception desk. He was feeling good inside, did not want to bother with this triviality, so he crushed it in his palm. We'll jump to the bottom here. Makukali quickly unfolded it because information was power. So he changes his mind. He reads the message. The 4 lines did not make sense. He turned the note over to see if there was more. Nothing. So he read it again. I have no pass. Take care of yourself. The country is pregnant. What it will give birth to, nobody knows. It was initialed WOC. The Wizard of the Crow, of course. No pass. So he had gone out and found himself unable to get back to the ruler's suite. Makukali admitted to himself that he, the minister, was to blame for the wizard's disappearance. As he scrutinized the wizard's enigmatic note, he wondered whether it was addressed to him personally, or to him in his capacity as a senior cabinet minister, who was to bring it to the attention of the ruler. So, we jump down to the bottom here. He goes to talk to the ruler. He went to the section reserved for the ruler. The engineers had been unable to devise a chair or bed large enough to contain him, so the floor was all he had. And what do you propose to do about your marching to heaven? The ruler asked, without giving Makukali a chance to say what had brought before him in his august presence. So the ruler is able to speak again once he sees him. He's like, hey, you, what are we doing about this?
All he cares about is his grandiose structures, right? Building something that honors him.
Exactly. We'll go to the next slide here. Makukali saw an opening to bring up the wizard's note. With a casual by the way, he asked the ruler if he still remembered the man who helped unlock his voice. But neither by word nor by look did the ruler show any sign of remembrance of what Makukali was talking about, a time when words got stuck in his throat, let alone an awareness of anybody having treated him. It was as if his entire ordeal of speechlessness had never occurred. Makukali had to ask again, and this time he made sure he mentioned the name, Wizard of the Crow. A sorcerer, the ruler interrupted him. Why do people keep on pestering me with questions of sorcerers, even in America?
Love it.
And so he shows him the note. The ruler, we're at the bottom here. The ruler read the 4 lines and turned the page over as Makukali had done. Finally, he raised his eyes. Who wrote this? The ruler asked in a cold and even tone. The Wizard of the Crow, Makukali said. The ruler leaned back and closed his eyes as if trying to recall a dream forgotten or a distant memory. I don't know if I'm dreaming or not, but when I close my eyes, I seem to see or hear a person answering to that name. It is as if he and I are talking, or rather, he is talking to me. But no, how is that possible? Your mighty, on the next slide, Your Mighty Excellency, you are not dreaming, Makukali hastened to say, hoping to channel the ruler's suppressed anger. There was indeed somebody like the one you now saw. Where is he now? The ruler interrupted. I don't know. Maybe he returned to those who sent him, said Makukali, trying to distance himself from the Wizard of the Crow. We'll jump to the bottom now. We'll go to the next slide, actually. This all is not that important. I mostly have these as placements so I can remember where we are on the story.
Of course.
Read this note very carefully, the ruler told him, handing him back the piece of paper. Was the ruler being sarcastic, Makukali wondered, or was he merely luring him into the range of his club? He could not very well say no and walk away. Makukali took 2 steps forward, reached for the note, and instinctively stepped back, acting as if he were looking for better lighting to read. No matter how hard he looked at it, how often he turned it over, Makukali did not see anything beyond what he knew to be there. When Makukali lifted his eyes, he was startled to see the eyes of the ruler, a light so intense that for a moment Makukali feared the worst. Your mighty excellency, I must confess that before coming to see you, I had already read these words to see if they implied any hidden messages, but I failed to see what the Wizard of the Crow was trying to say, and that is why I brought you the note. Read it again and tell me what you think is not so very clear about the meaning of those words. I didn't ask you to read it silently to yourself, the ruler said. Read it aloud and firmly like a man, but substitute the word ruler for the country, as I am the country. Makukali cleared his... Right? Just wild. Makukali cleared his throat. He started reading the note. I have no pass. Take care of yourself. The ruler is... Makukali stopped abruptly like a person who finds himself on the edge of a precipice. Go on, read it, the ruler told him impatiently. Finish and tell me what's so unclear about the meaning. The ruler is pregnant. What he will give birth to, nobody knows. What's not clear? Tell me, His Mighty Excellency said with mounting anger. So he's implying, so the ruler seized because he is the country, he is the one who's pregnant. We'll go to the next page. I would not make... Makukali was now unnerved by what he detected as a slight change in the voice of the ruler. It sounded broken, more teary than icy. You are a very highly educated man, is that not so, Marcus? Yes, your holy and mighty excellency. I would not make such a claim, but yes, I would say that I am not totally ignorant. In all the books that you have read, have you ever come across a case of a pregnant ruler? No, unless he was a woman, definitely not. Can't you see what he's saying? That this self-induced expansion is a pregnancy of sorts. The ruler started laughing, and Makukali wondered whether he should join in to show that he too got the joke, whatever it may have been. There are times when silence is golden, but this was not one of them.
Ooh, wow.
And so he says, congratulations. All we need to know for the next 2 slides. He says, congratulations, you're pregnant. And the ruler says, what? What are you talking about? Congratulations. I'm not a woman. How dare you call me a woman? And the last thing on the next slide, the very last line, the ruler grabbed the piece of paper, put it in his mouth, chewed it, and swallowed it, all while staring at Makukali. I must never hear this matter out of anybody's mouth.
Oh, no, no one can know that he's pregnant.
Exactly. But the rumors do spread. The
myth is alive, right?
Yeah, I'm just going to read the first part of this slide because it just shows how the myth becomes, the myth is reality. It was the sound of the plane landing that announced the return of the ruler from his famous visit to America, for it was louder than thunder. People said that only his mightiness could produce thunder without lightning and rain, but there was something wrong with it, people added, because the ruler came back home under the cover of darkness like a thief. So people think something's not quite right here, and the ruler locks himself up in the state house, and there's no official statements or anything, and people start to wonder what has happened to the ruler. And this is why at the beginning of the book there are all these rumors about the ruler's illness. So we're now kind of tying into the beginning of the story. We'll go to the next slide. Now he's interviewing the chairman of Marching to Heaven, Titus Tajirika. And Tajirika says that all these people gave him money, and it was because of counting the money that he became possessed by the if curse, or the white ache. And so he's talking about the money. And the ruler says, wait, what money? Like 3 bags of money in the whole day? And he says here, it was not even a whole day, just a matter of a few hours in the afternoon. One afternoon, a few hours, pressed the ruler. Yes, a couple hours. And these big sacks, each more than 5 feet by 2, full of money. Not just full, I had to push the notes down with my hands and even with my feet until each bag was tight and as heavy as a sack of grain. But alas, just when I thought that I'd finally crossed the valley of poverty into permanent wealth, I became ill. But after getting well, I never once received another envelope stashed with dollars, all in $100 bills. Dollars? They bribed you in American dollars, the ruler kept asking. Well, they were out to impress me. He's the chairman of Marching to Heaven, right? This is the biggest project that the country has ever seen.
Right.
They said the buries were valueless. The bury notes were valueless, the ruler repeated. He was about to explode with expletives, but changed his mind. Why no more dollars afterward? Your mighty excellency, when I recovered from my illness, I found that all the powers of my office had been assumed by my deputy, John Kinuru. And so, what's important? We'll go to the next slide here. I skip ahead a bit. Basically, Tajirika says that he buried them. He gave the money to the Wizard of the Crow as payment for curing him. When he asks what the wizard did with it, Tajirika says, "Oh, he told me. He said that he buried it in the prairie between Santa Maria and Santa Lucia, which is the same prairie where he was pursued by the police officer." So he buried the money, which is true. He does bury the money. And so they send some people to go find the money.
Of course. Wow.
Pretty ridiculous.
That greed, right?
The greed always. When he came to this point in his narrative, AG would pause and ask his audience dramatically, "Why do you think I'm expressing our exhaustion?" But before anybody could respond, AG would answer his own question. "I don't know what it was. Maybe the bush made me think about the night I chased the Wizard of the Crow and his guides as a beggar, or two, all the way from paradise to Santa Lucia. Just as on that night I felt driven by a force so powerful I could not even stop if I tried, so too on this night, true, Hakiya Mungu, I felt myself propelled by a power unknown to me. At one point I almost tripped over a ridge. I stopped. Before me was a rock ridge cleft in two, the space between them covered by grass and wild growth. I felt a funny feeling in my belly. For true, Hakiya Mungu, when I looked all around, I remembered being in the same bush the night after I ran after the Wizard of the Crow, and that this was the same ridge over which I had tripped and fallen, losing him, or both of them, or whatever. Later I would come to learn that my fall had not been accidental, that it had been the work of the wizard. But what is the meaning of the coincidence now? Had the Wizard of the Crow buried the treasure here, guarded by the powers of the netherworld? We'll go to the middle here. Tajirika thought he was seeing things. The leaves of the 3 bushes in front of him were no ordinary leaves. But no, he could not believe his eyes, and he tried to cry out to the others. He could not find words to tell them what he was seeing, so he just pointed, whispering hoarsely, "Look, please look, and tell me if this is not more trickery by the Wizard of the Crow. Tell me if those are not American dollars growing on those bushes." None of us could believe what we were hearing. We looked at one another with the same thought. Money growing on trees? He's gone mad. But on closer inspection, we had to agree that those leaves did look like American dollars. Yet we harbored doubts, which disappeared when Tajirika took money from his pocket and, with hands shaking, approached the bushes to compare what he had in his hand and what was there. True, Hakiya Mungu, from where we sat, nobody could tell the difference between the two. If anything, those that grew on the bushes seemed smoother and greener, a little less wrinkled than the bills from Tajirika's pockets. Some of the leaves had tiny holes in them and others were frayed at the edges. But Tajirika, our leader, explained that this was the work of worms and other insects who did not understand the value of $1. Tajirika fell on his knees before the bushes and started sobbing with joy like a death row inmate whose sentence had been commuted when execution seemed inevitable and imminent. "We are saved," he cried, and the others said amen in unison. So they bring the money trees to the ruler. The ruler doesn't believe it. He's like, "What are you talking about?" They send these armored vehicles out to the prairies. They put the money trees in the armored vehicles and they escort them to the State House. We were each told to stand behind each present, wrapped in sisal, and in turn untie them under the ruler's watchful eyes. Kahiga was the first to unwrap his. At this point, AG would whisper even lower, and some frustrated listeners, believing that he had really lost his voice, would get up to leave, allowing that rumors of what he would say would overtake them anyway. We're on the next slide now. So what happened, they would ask him, and AG would take his time, shaking his head as if still incredulous of what he had seen and heard. Kahiga's jaw fell, he would say, and then pause to let the image etch itself properly in their memories. Why? Why? The pestilence. They had the body of a white termite and the head and mandibles of a red ant. How can I describe them? They were as big as locusts. I don't even know if they were termites, but I may be wrong. There were more than 2,000 species, and these could have been one of them or a mutant breed. I'll just call them pests. White pests. What are you talking about? They would ask, wondering if the storyteller had had one beer too many. All the leaves and all the roots of the bush had been eaten by the pests, leaving nothing but bare twigs. Kahiga and Noya cried out in unison, "What is this?" Kahiga rushed and turned over the soil as he recounted to see if the leaves were buried there, only to find more termites fattened to the size of big worms or caterpillars after feasting on leaves of money for more than 7 days. He, like the others, could not say what was more amazing, the size of the termite-like creatures or the fact that the pests had eaten all the money. The ruler did not utter a word, but pointed to the next parcel and its guardian. It was Noya's turn. Here, too, the termites had eaten all the leaves as well as the bark, leaving the plants completely denuded. And now came AG's turn. We're on the next slide now. The termites had not been as thorough with mine. They were still devouring the few remaining leaves before our very eyes. I quickly brushed the pests away. They fell to the floor, leaving shreds of money dangling as if to mock me. Now I can say that the protective magic of the Wizard of the Crow had served me well, for judging by the look in the ruler's eyes, none of us would be breathing today but for those remnants of leaves. True, Hakiyamungu, I believe they saved us from his wrath, for they had enough green left on them to show that there may have been a time when they had the full greenness of a natural dollar. The ruler stared at the scene, brooding on the fate of we mortal sinners. Frozen with anger, he pondered how best to express his wrath. And we'll go to the next slide. But none anticipated anything remotely resembling the ruler's reaction. It was the tone of his voice that first caught them unaware. He spoke like an elder talking to his children about matters he himself had experienced. He was soothing as he told them not to worry about what had happened, and actually commended them for doing their best, considering the treacherous cunning mind they had been up against. They should have no fear, he told them, for the cunning fellow would never outsmart the ruler. He told them to remain seated and be patient, that he wanted a couple ministers to join them as he, the ruler, announced what was to be done about the dangerous mind. But he enjoined them not to so much as whisper about the money trees or the termites. This was now a state secret. Do you hear me, he asked, now looking at AG, Kahiga, and Noya in turn. You must never even dream about plants to produce natural dollars or any other currency, or I will turn your dream into a nightmare.
So interesting.
It's very bizarre. So this is some weird magic at work here. And we'll go to the bottom of this slide. This man cannot be left free. He's thinking about the Wizard of the Crow, the ruler. And he says, this man cannot be left free to roam the country. Neither could he be left with the power that the ruler did not possess. He would have him apprehended and soften him with flattery and promises till he revealed the secrets of his knowledge, how to cultivate money trees and divine through mirrors. Having incorporated the powers of the wizard into himself, the ruler would have him thrown into a dungeon, fry the pig in his own fat, for the ruler now intended nothing short of becoming sorcerer number one. Heaving with rage and expectation. I know, right?
I saw this coming. No one can have power outside of the ruler, right? So as soon as you believe that the sorcerer actually has real power, now he must become a possession or must die.
Exactly. And he says, bring him to me, not dead in a shroud, but alive in chains. We'll go to the next slide. True, Hakiyamungu, AG was later to claim. I told him that no human hands could draw the likeness of the Wizard of the Crow. Ask yourselves, who was the Wizard of the Crow? Was he a man or a woman? Personally, I knew that he possessed the ability to change himself into man or woman, or into anything else. He is a whirlwind. He is lightning. He is a thunderstorm. He is the sun and the rain. He is the moon and the stars. How can you draw the likeness of air, breath, and soul? The Wizard of the Crow is the being that animated everything. And how can you draw a picture of that? I told him, give me the time, give me a free hand, and I will track him down. So this just goes to show how this myth of the Wizard of the Crow just keeps spiraling. He is the being that animates everything. This is the Wizard of the Crow.
Now he can create money and he can challenge the ruler. It's like
it's wild.
It's so wild, right? And he was probably just like, I don't trust the banks. I'm afraid of holding all this cash. Let me go bury this cash in the desert, you know? Like,
just wild.
crazy thing.
So now we'll go to the next slide. We're jumping ahead here a bit. The ruler has decided to show himself in public. The ruler entered Parliament and walked down the aisle on a red carpet. To his right was a woman dressed magnificently, wearing a diamond tiara. AG could hardly believe his eyes. This excellency on television was hardly the excellency he had last seen at the State House. This excellency was tall and thin. He was dressed in a dark suit with a boutonniere, a white handkerchief in the breast pocket. In his left hand he held a club and a fly whisk. The usual patches of leopard skins were there. His head was the size of a fist, but his eyes bulged, resembling the late Makukali's. AG did not hear himself as he shouted, "No, no, that is not him," over and over again. The others looking at him as if a crazy person, some of them barking impatiently, "Shut up! How do you know?" Without allowing him to explain, to which he responded, "What happened to his inflated body?" And at this the people laughed, but when he tried to say, "Look at his tongue, look at the tongue," they silenced him with poisonous looks. Yet some also noticed that when the ruler was not talking, he would sometimes flick his tongue in and out involuntarily. The most saw nothing strange in this, attributing it to his not having used his tongue in public for a long time. When AG now further insisted that the tongue was forked, people around started saying, "The smog, see what is done to this man's head, and maybe he is not the only one." So the ruler appears. He's tall, he's slim, his head is tiny, and he has this forked tongue that flicks in and out of his mouth.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Just wild. The ruler thanked all those who had come to the grounds of Parliament and the law courts to celebrate his it's his birthday. That's why he's coming out to address the people. To celebrate his birthday, renaming it the Day of National Self-Renewal. Because according to an age-old African custom, cycles of birth and rebirth are celebrated through well-known rites of passage. He was also aware that there were those who were talking about his birthday, the Day of National Self-Renewal, as the day he would give birth. They were not mistaken. The fact is, my people, I was pregnant. Yes, I was pregnant, the ruler emphasized to an astonished Parliament. Every Aberdarian child knows that I am the country, and the country is me, which means that this excellency, this country, and this nation are like the mystery of 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, creating the perfect one.
Oh, wow.
So he's invoking like the Holy Trinity here.
Yeah, he's
when referring to himself.
Reality, right? Yeah, he's Akhenaten, right? The ruler of Egypt who tried to be the sole representative of the god of the sun, right?
Exactly. Wow. That was why when the ruler spoke, the nation spoke. And when he sneezed, the nation sneezed. Because the country and the head are one and the same. It follows that his birthday is the nation's birthday. And his day of giving birth is as that of the nation giving birth. Do you want to see the pictures of the baby? On cue, Kanyuru, using crutches, hobbled into Parliament, followed by 4 people carrying a huge billboard wrapped up in a white cloth, and set it up in front of the ruler. And now, said the ruler, I ask the official hostess to step forward and reveal what I've brought into the world. Dr. Unique Immaculate Mackenzie walked to the board and lifted the cloth, revealing a drawing of the ruler holding a baby, vaguely resembling Abereria in his fatherly arms. At the foot was the inscription in large Abererian national colors, Baby D. Behold, baby, democracy, he said. The ruler then grandly proclaimed the advent of multi-party democracy in Abereria, to everyone's shock. But he added that the new Abererian system was only making explicit what was latent in all modern democracies. We're on the next slide now. In which parties were basically variations of each other. He would be the nominal head of all political parties. This meant that in the next general elections, all the parties would, of course, be choosing him as their candidate for the presidency. His victory would be a victory of all the parties, and more important for Abererians, a victory for wise and tested leadership.
Oh my God. So anything but democracy.
Yeah. As a sign of the new times, he decreed that the ruler's party would now simply be called the ruling party. And in case our dear friends are worried that we might be going too far in our liberal measures, he says, glancing in the direction of the row of Western ambassadors, he wanted to stress that whichever party from among the hundreds of his leadership came to power, Abereria would remain a friend and trustworthy partner of the Western Alliance. I worked hand in hand with you in fighting world communism, he said, and now we shall stand shoulder to shoulder in building the new global system of guided freedom and openness. That was why his new system would do away with secret ballots and introduce queuing, by which one openly it's so funny, by which one openly stood behind the candidate of one's choice. Direct democracy, open democracy. Baby D is born.
That's not direct democracy.
I know. It's very bizarre. It's very bizarre, this like twisted perspective that he has of like what the future of the country should be. And it's still him at the center.
Yeah. They're just changing the veneer. He's adapting to the times to maintain his illusion of control, right? It's like the ruler reinvents himself as Baby D, right? But it's not democracy. It's just another fucking ruler.
Yeah.
Oh,
AG,
God.
who had not been waited for the end of the ceremony, caught up with the rest of the ruler's address in the newspapers the following day. New ministers to nurture Baby D were announced. 2 women were appointed to Parliament and made assistant ministers for women's and children's affairs. The ruler promised to rely on his 2 pillars of wisdom in his furtherance of the needs of Baby D. One of them was Tajirika, erstwhile governor of the central bank, who is now back as member of parliament and minister of finance. The other was John Kinyuru, the ex-youth leader. So, the ruler quickly responded, without of course referring to the ambassador directly. In an official clarification of his remarks when introducing Baby D, he said that he would not intrude in the day-to-day operations of the parties. He would leave that to their chosen leaders. He would assume leadership of only the party that won general elections. The de facto leader of the winning party would automatically become vice president, solving the problem of succession in the event of the unexpected. With this clarification, the ruler's reforms received cautious acceptance from Gabriel Gemstone. He's an official for the America, which opened many doors. The Global Ministry of Finance and the Global Bank issued a joint statement congratulating the ruler for abandoning, actually they used the word jettisoning, useless schemes like marching to heaven, accepting in advance each and every condition the 2 institutions would attach to their loans, and bringing technocrats, war heroes, and proven businessmen into his cabinet. But most significant was their agreement to enter into negotiations with the new government to release frozen loans and aid packages. Kinyuru and Tajirika were invited to Washington to discuss the defense and economic policy needs of a democratic Abereria. So he's abandoned marching to heaven in favor of this. He says, I'll win their favor by claiming that I'm like democratic.
Yeah, he's changing the game.
Changing the game.
He's adapting.
And now
Sorry,
no, you go.
Recognize that old myth is no longer as potent as it once was, because he's starting to inflate and lose. He's got to reinvent himself, and he's going through. Makes me think of the tarot. He's going through his Ion card moment. He's rebirthing himself now as Baby D, but it's just himself in another cloak.
Exactly. Just donning a new disguise. So here we go to how he became thin again. Even now in his residence at the table in bed, the ruler shuddered on recalling the day and hour of the explosions. His intention had been to direct the open-air performance outside the grounds of the Parliament buildings and law courts, so as to thwart the efforts of the so-called People's Assembly. He was eager to win what was shaping up as a battle of wills between him and the Wizard of the Crow, and despite the pain he was suffering, he had sensed victory. One way or another, the Wizard of the Crow would yield, and the ruler had decided to dispatch him to the next world only after the wizard had conferred on him his occult powers. But then he felt the ballooning of his body and the contractions intensifying. He had managed to authorize only one helicopter to take... Sorry, we'll skip ahead a bit. He was possessed by an unbearable pain and about to explode. Before his descent into blankness, he felt as if his body was on the verge of bursting through the orifices, as if his being was on the verge of bursting through the orifices of his body. When he later emerged from unconsciousness, he found himself mired in the darkness of his filth, still slowly escaping through the roof, blasted by the force of his corruption. His only casualty was a forked tongue. Otherwise, and despite being exhausted, he felt tall and powerful as he lay there overwhelmed by his contribution to universal darkness. He remained in a hypnotic state for 28 hours, until his generals emerged from their hiding places, insisting that they had been busy investigating the source of the bombing, which is these weird explosions from his body. He knew they were lying, but it did not matter. The explanations later became the unified story of the heroics of the ruler and his generals as they battled terrorist bombs.
Wow.
For 7 nights and days, the ruler thought about Tajirika's words, for they echoed vague thoughts in his mind, and then it dawned on him ever so clearly why everything had been going so smoothly. On the day of the auto explosion, he had not only conquered the bodily form of the Wizard of the Crow, but had also incorporated his occult powers into himself. With the wizard and the limping witch out of the way, he was the sorcerer supreme, able to manipulate Abereria, the West, the global ministry of finance, the global bank, democracy, the living, and the dead, the whole lot. He was now the #1 sorcerer in all of Abereria. So it's important to point out here is that the Wizard of the Crow gets invited by the ruler before an assembly. I don't want to spoil what happens for people that read the books, but they assume now that the Wizard of the Crow is dead.
Wow.
And the ruler assumes that this sudden explosion, this release of his bodily expansion and his transformation into this new form, is him absorbing the magical power of the wizard. And now he has the power of the living and the dead, as he calls it.
Over everything, right? It's like, now I am the greatest wizard and I have all control in Abereria and the West even. I can control everything.
Right?
You're all puppets. Wow.
We're almost at the end here. Now he goes to visit his wife, Rachel. For those who haven't watched the first part yet or who don't remember, Rachel is his wife. She accuses him of sleeping with school children, and he creates a mansion that was surrounded by fences that he imprisons her in. The only clothes she can wear are the clothes she wore on that night that she accused him. All the clocks and calendars are set to the time and day that she accused him. The meals that she eats are always the last meal where she accused him. And so in hopes that she will break and cry. And if she cries, then there'll be a sign of repentance. So what happens when the ruler, accompanied by his biographer, Luminous Karumbu Mbu, went to visit Rachel that night is much disputed. The guard with the key to the gate at the entrance to the compound was nowhere to be seen. There were those who say that the ruler squeezed through a narrow opening between the wall and the gate, and given his new slim body, this posed no problem. He crawled on his belly the rest of the way to catch Rachel unaware before she could wipe her tears away. When finally he reached the house, he appeared through a window, and it was then that Rachel, still wearing the dress she wore the night she had quarreled over his predilections for young girls, and thinking that she had seen a long-necked something with a tiny head and a forked tongue, threw the lantern at the thing. The paraffin poured out, the house caught fire, and seeing this, the ruler and luminous Karamumumbu ran back the way they came. Other accounts say no, it was not quite like that. The guard had disappeared, and when the ruler went to the house, Rachel had come to the door and told him, "I know it is you." And instead of crying, she laughed in his face. And because she had not laughed for a long time, her ribs shook with the laughter and collapsed from within, and Rachel disintegrated into a heap of bones. The lantern fell on the heap of bones, caught fire, and the flames from the fire of her immolation ignited the rest of the house, spreading to the plantation. A ball of fire detached itself from the rest and pursued the fleeing ruler and his faithful biographer all the way back to the gates of the State House. The memory of the ball of fire and relentless pursuit gave him insomnia, and to induce sleep, the ruler had his loyal biographer read him a chapter from the book he was writing. The biography was not complete, a work in progress, he would say, but the ruler told him to read from the copious notes he had taken. Every night a chapter was read, and this made the ruler revisit the scenes of his past challenges, battles, and triumphs, a strange sensation as if he were living his life twice or thrice over again. One night he told him to read the section that dealt with his most recent triumph, and the biographer faithfully read how blasts of thunder like stealthy missiles had fired from each of the ruler's 7 orifices, and then exploded in turns. He had described in detail how the second blast of thunder launched the foreign doctors sky high, and how he, luminous Karemu Imbu, bravely hung on till he too was launched, a human missile, into the sky by the 5th or 6th blast of thunder, so had no details of the 7th. The ruler did not listen to the end, for his mind was occupied with the sudden realization that the loyal biographer knew too much, that if he could write and record what happened so openly, so vividly, and so graphically, an account that completely contradicted the official version of the rulers and his generals' heroics as they struggled with bombs exploding. What could he inadvertently say about the story of Rachel and the plantation fire? This man had no imagination to sugarcoat reality and made it more palatable. How did I engage such a fool? Whatever the case, luminous Karamumbu, the ex-communist born again as a loyal biographer, was never seen again, with rumors later claiming that the man had been crushed under the weight of his huge pen and notebook.
Oh, wow.
So the ruler hasn't really changed. Ruler hasn't really changed much. But the most salient part of this, no, he is just, again, he's wearing a different guise. But the most salient part of the success story was that the Global Ministry of Finance and the Global Bank had agreed to release the previously frozen funds now that the plans for marching to heaven had been abandoned, replaced by Baby D. "You have done well," the ruler told the ministers. "The power is yours, my lord, and the glory. Long live Baby D," they said in unison, but accidentally, for each had hoped to have the last word in sycophancy.
What a great line.
Right? At the advice of Tajirika, the ruler declared a day when the effigies of the cursed four, Mambo, Makakali, Nyawira, and the Wizard of the Crow, were to be burned to ensure that their spirits would never come back to haunt the ruling. With television crews following them, ministers, members of parliament, and convoys of loyal youth outdid one another in burning the biggest possible effigy of their chosen traitor, with some even throwing the flaming figure into the sea. What showed on the screen later that day were scenes of jubilation and triumph, but rumors and eyewitness accounts told of strange happenings. True, Hakiyamungu, AG would tell his listeners years later, the effigies of Nyawira and the Wizard of the Crow would not burn. Instead, they spat balls of fire that chased those who had tried to burn them.
Wow.
And I won't spoil the very end. I won't spoil the very ending of the book because it's quite beautiful, and I think people should read the book. But again, the whole point of this, and why I think that this book is important, is to emphasize the living aspect of the myth and how we need to incorporate the living myth into our lives. You know, it's because the myth is all around us, and we need to see it for what it is, and we need to also be cautious because some of these myths may lead us astray, right? And so it's about
Right.
approaching the myth. It's about approaching the myth with a critical and loving embrace. I think maybe.
Yeah, I think it's also understanding just how powerful these narratives are. How it does it. It's not about whether it's real or false or ridiculous. It's about how people perceive them, and this book I think is just so important to read and to understand in our current reality where we're living in sort of a post-news almost world where it's all about constructing these mythopoeic narratives and creating these myths and these cults of personality, and it's wild to see. What we see is we see that the the tyrant evolves with the times. When the myth of the single ruler is no longer working, when the global bank is saying, hey, this is not suiting our needs, it evolves into baby D. Right? It's still the ruler,
Exactly.
still
Still
the
a
ruler.
ruler, but there's the hope that when the ruler passes, the narrative will shift again. If the ruler passes, they say the ruler can't die, that he lives forever. So, and which he does in a way as a myth.
Exactly. He continues to live, and and even as this baby D takes over, it is the child of the previous ruler. And even if it's completely supplants that previous myth, it's the same oppressive system. Just, now it has a
Just
fancy
sugar
shiny
coated.
new name and a new coat, right? you know it's just like kings are always put up and are empowered by those beautiful myths of the benevolent king. But bad democracies are put up by the beautiful image of a true direct democracy. It's no different.
So true.
It's so interesting. Yeah, and just the power of these stories to like that wizard character. It's like it's not so much what he does, but how the world reacts to him that defines his character, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's
it's
quite
so
wild.
it's so wild, and like people make all this big deal out of it, but you don't really know if it's like it's only a big deal because you believe it's a big deal. But that's also sort of the wizard's power, is that he has that reason to sift through the BS, to get to the heart of the matters, to see clearly what the anxiety and the emotional turmoil is. Like you said, he can be that bringer of perspective, that reflective mirror, to allow us to see ourselves clearly. What is holding ourselves back? What are we doing? Where the wizard, the great power of the wizard is that he flows and he utilizes the myth, you know?
Definitely. There's a scene where there's this couple and they claim to be tempted by Satan to desire other people's bodies. And they go actually to see the Wizard of the Crow. And initially to ferret him out and to convert him to Catholicism, to Christianity. But as he's talking to him, he's like, "What ails you? Why are you here?" And they're like, they eventually confess that they have this desire for other people's bodies, that they no longer care for each other's bodies anymore. And instead of using the mirror, he says, I want you to go home, and you, the husband, I want you to cook your wife a delicious meal, because they say it's always a woman that cooks for the men. He's like, I want that to change. That will not defy your religion if you do this. And he says, cook a meal for her, surprise her, let her relish in what you can offer her, and then take some oil and bathe together and rub the oil over every inch of your body so that no blemish or scar is untouched. And they're so curious about this and so intrigued by what they might discover on each other's bodies that they skip the preliminaries and they go straight to that, and they marvel at each other's bodies once again. And
Wow.
it repairs their relationship,
And
because
they
he's
stop
saying,
wanting to possess others.
exactly, he's like, it's not about actually desiring others, it's about not realizing that you still have the desire for each other.
Oh, that's
And
beautiful.
yeah,
And that's a true healer, right? Be getting to the heart and seeing what's there, right? But that's so interesting. And the power of both the ruler and the wizard are in this ability to move with and to dawn and utilize the myth, right? As a way to empower or to reveal. But at the end of the day, you know, the ruler is bound and completely imprisoned. But I imagine that the wizard, you know, we don't want to spoil it, but I imagine that the wizard got away in the end. You know, I can't see him getting possessed by that, you know, by
No,
that tyrant energy. It just doesn't make sense, you
no,
know.
I won't spoil it, but the wizard does not become a tyrant.
All right, but yeah, oh wow, this was so much fun, man. So, any last words you want to leave us with to think about with Wizards of the Crow, or Wizards, sorry, of the Crow?
Wizard of the Crow, I guess just when you hear stories and you read news and you read articles, be critical. Approach it with a rational mind. Think about what's being told because there are many narratives at play in our world, and it's easy to get caught up in them and get caught up in echo chambers and become trapped by myth when really it should be something that is liberating us.
Right. That's beautifully said. Beautifully said, right? Myth can possess us and can color our reality and degrade us. It can veil us, or it can help us to comprehend and perceive the truth. It's all about how we choose to engage it. Are you pursuing the path of the wizard, or are you pursuing the path of the ruler? Are you trying to be greedy and possess people, or are you trying to know the self and know the world? Right?
Exactly. Well said. Well said.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you guys all for joining us. Please, everyone, leave us a like and a subscribe. Before we call it an end, Graham, is there any work that you've been doing that you want to showcase or talk to the audience about? Any new projects that are coming out?
Yeah. So just one. I'm releasing this chapbook. It's only about 10 or 12 pages, called "A Chorus of Angels Sing These Mournful Hymns." And I wrote it in one night last week, and it's going to be included for free with any orders from my books. It's just a little bonus as a thank you. Here's an offering of magic.
Love it. And you included another one of those masks by that Jim Davis artist.
Yeah, the front and back are graced by masks by Jim Davis. He has this whole series of masks called the Angels, and that's what inspired these poems.
Beautiful. And we will be doing a deep dive into that hopefully pretty soon. We'll discuss that later.
Yeah.
But that's amazing. Definitely. Really looking forward to it. And you also just released a chapbook recently. Just a few weeks ago.
I released The Dust of Our Lives. We did a great talk on it recently. It was so much fun. And it's a bit of magic, a bit of darkness, a bit of life.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. If you're interested, you can see the live stream that Graham and I did where we dive deep into it, and Graham reads us several of the poems from the collection. So please go check that out. And also, if you like this, please go check out part 1 if you haven't yet for Wizard of the Crow. And we'll be back soon with more episodes of Searching for Dragons. We've been talking. There's so many more books that we want to discuss. So many more things. You were talking about House of Leaves, potentially more Artaud.
That'll be a long-term. House of Leaves will be a long-term project. The other one I want to talk about is The Letters from Ireland by Artaud.
Right.
I think that'll be a lot of fun. It's from this book, 1937 Apocalypse by Infinity Land Press. It's sold out currently, but I don't know if there's plans for a future publication. But it's all of the surviving letters from his trip to Ireland to his friends, all of his correspondences, and it's some wild stuff. I think people will have a lot of fun with that.
Just to tease people and to remind them, this was kind of Artaud's most apocalyptic time in his life, when he was at kind of his most, just before he was put into the institution. So he kind of just goes to Ireland on a whim. He's dressed up in his wizard gear. He has his magical staff. He believes the apocalypse is coming. He believes he is the incarnation of Christ. He's not paying any of his bills. He's living off of the handouts of the good Irish people. It's kind of a wild moment, right?
It's very wild. This is just after his trip to Mexico. He's had a transformative experience with peyote. He's seeing signs and symbols everywhere. He changes he starts signing his name on his books that he releases as the Revealed One instead of Antoine Artaud.
Right. He says he's dead. Artaud is dead. He's destroyed the body and become the body without organs. All this wildness.
Yeah.
Love it. But that'll be so much fun to dig into. So we're looking forward to that. So please check in with us again soon when we do more Searching for Dragons and more deep dives into Graham's poetry. If you're interested in purchasing any of Graham's books, you can find in his link tree in the description below. But yeah, this was so much fun. Peace and love. Thank you, Graham. And we will see you guys again for another episode soon. So take care.
Master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave, and I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave, and I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave, and I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave, and I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave, and I wondered